Task Lieutenant Commander Tishi Nakazawa's hands shook as he translated the latest. It was May 27, 1942, and what he saw would stay with him forever. The Americans had figured it out. They knew everything. The intercepted message from Pearl Harbor's communication center mentioned AF, the Japanese code for Midway. Even more shocking, it showed they understood Admiral Yamamoto's detailed attack plan, including the timing and the makeup of Vice Admiral Nagumo's strike group. Nakazawa had spent 3 nights checking and comparing different intercepted messages. Each new one confirmed his worst fears. The Americans were setting a trap. There was no doubt the American codebreakers had cracked Japan's secret communication system, known to them as JN-25. Admiral Chester Nimitz was already preparing his forces based on that information. The surprise Japan had counted on was gone. When Nakazawa showed the documents to Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's top advisor, Ugaki barely looked at them. He brushed them off and said, "The Americans can't have this kind of detailed knowledge. Our codes are unbreakable, and their fleet is still weak from Pearl Harbor. This is just a trick to mislead us." But Nakazawa didn't give up. He raised his voice, trying to get the admiral to listen. "Sir, the messages are too specific. They mention ship names, formations, and even weather details that only our own planners would know. It's like they're quoting our own secret orders back to us." Still, Ugaki dismissed him with a wave of his hand. This overconfidence wasn't just Hyugaki's, was common among Japan's naval leadership. They had won many battles since Pearl Harbor and had taken control of areas from the Philippines to Indonesia. These victories made them underestimate their enemy. They didn't believe the Americans, whom they saw as weaker, could ever break their codes. But, according to later U.S. intelligence records, some Japanese leaders on land had a feeling the Americans knew about the Midway attack, but that warning never made it to the fleet. Commanders who needed it, below deck on the carrier Akagi, Commander Minoru Genda was also starting to feel nervous. He was in charge of air operations for Nagumo and had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. Genda had a deep understanding of naval warfare. Now, the reports he was seeing didn't sit right. Some came from Japanese submarines watching Hawaiian waters. These reports showed that several American carriers had quietly left Pearl Harbor. Japanese strategy expected the American carriers to stay near their home base after Pearl Harbor to protect the U.S. mainland. But the submarines saw signs that the American fleet was heading north into the Central Pacific. Genda asked to speak to Admiral Nagumo directly about this troubling information, but the admiral's team turned down his request. They said the operation was going as planned, and there was no time for distractions. Japan's strict military structure meant lower officers couldn't easily share urgent information with those in charge. On May 29th, as the Japanese fleet got closer to Midway, a Japanese radio operator named Hiroshi Suzuki picked up another American message. It was in plain English and came from Midway Island. It was a plea for help and supplies, but what stood out was that it also mentioned Japanese planes and said they were expected to arrive at 6 a.m. This showed that the Americans not only knew about the attack, they knew exactly when it was coming. On June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo stood on the deck of the Akagi as the sun rose. He looked across the quiet ocean, unaware that 3 American carrier groups were nearby, just out of sight. Behind him, Lieutenant Tanabe, an intelligence officer, came forward with more intercepted American messages. These showed clear knowledge of Japan's fleet movements and attack plans. One message even said for Japanese carriers approaching from the northwest, something only top Japanese leaders should know. But Nagumo turned around, annoyed rather than worried. "The American Navy is scattered and weak," he said. "Their messages are just guesses. We've surprised them, just like Admiral Yamamoto planned." What Nagumo didn't realize was that Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher already had access to his plans. U.S. codebreakers in Pearl Harbor were not only reading Japan's secret messages, they were decoding them faster than some Japanese officers could read them. Fletcher knew exactly what Nagumo's force included. For carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, and he knew when they were planning to attack. This wasn't just a case of broken codes. The entire system of gathering information had been falling apart for months. A plan called Operation K, which was meant to spy on Pearl Harbor using a small island as a refueling point, had to be cancelled when Americans took control of that location. That meant Nagumo had no idea what the U.S. fleet was doing in the final. Days before the battle, during a meeting before dawn, he said, "We don't have confirmed reports on where the American carriers are. Our subs have noticed radio silence in Hawaiian waters, which might mean they're moving." But Captain Okada, one of Nagumo's senior officers, dismissed the warning. "The Americans are too afraid to fight. Their carriers are staying near home. We only have to deal with Midway's land defenses," he said. This view turned out to be a serious mistake. At that same time, Admiral Spruance's Task Force 16 and Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 17 were taking position northeast of Midway. They had left Pearl Harbor 3 days earlier, guided by the decoded Japanese messages. The American fleet included the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, with cruisers and destroyers almost equal in strength to Nagumo's force. One of Japan's biggest weaknesses was how it discouraged questioning senior leaders or accepting facts that didn't fit their plans. When Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, who led the second carrier group, shared his doubts with his own team, the warnings never made it up the chain of command. The strict structure that had worked well in peacetime became a huge problem during fast-moving battle situations. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo ordered the first wave of attacks on Midway. A total of 108 planes from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu took off. He kept the rest of the aircraft on standby, loaded with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case enemy ships appeared. This matched Japanese strategy, which focused on being ready to fight other fleets if needed. But Nagumo didn't know that radar on Midway Island had already picked up his planes at 5:20 a.m., giving the defenders over half an hour to prepare. Every available plane on the island took off to fight back even older fighters and dive bombers. More importantly, this early warning allowed Admiral Fletcher to launch his own attack while the Japanese carriers were in a vulnerable state, busy loading and fueling planes for the next strike. Asterisk, in a basement at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort sat at his desk, surrounded by decoded Japanese messages. It was June 3, 1942. His team had achieved what many thought was impossible. They had broken Japan's top naval code. They had done it months earlier, but this was the first time they could use it in a major sea battle. They knew everything when Yamamoto planned to attack, what ships would be used, and where they'd go. The plan showed Nagumo would approach from the northwest with 4 carriers, while Yamamoto followed with battleships. The Americans also spotted a major flaw in the plan. The carriers and battleships were too far apart to support each other. If trouble came up, this went against basic rules of naval warfare and left the carriers at risk. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, looked over the decoded messages with growing confidence. "We're reading Nagumo's orders almost as fast as his own staff," he said. The intelligence breakthrough wasn't just about strategy, they even knew the names of Japanese pilots, how much fuel their ships used, and the weather conditions that would impact the battle. Nothing like this had ever happened before in naval history. At Pearl Harbor's main command center, Admiral Nimitz calmly studied the decoded Japanese plans. He was known for being flexible and open-minded like many Japanese leaders. The messages were clear. Japan was sending all of its carriers into one major operation, hoping to surprise the Americans at Midway. "We've been handed a huge advantage," Nimitz told his officers. "The Japanese think they're surprising us, but we know their every move before they make it. We just have to use this knowledge the right way." This approach showed a major difference between the two sides. Japanese leaders ignored uncomfortable facts. American leaders used any information they could to gain the upper hand. Nimitz quickly ordered his carriers to leave Pearl Harbor and head toward Midway so they could meet the Japanese fleet head-on. Even small details helped the Americans. They knew that it took Japanese carriers about 45 minutes to get a full wave of planes ready. They knew how many planes each carrier held, how skilled the pilots were, and what radio channels they used to talk during attacks. Captain Miles Browning, Admiral Halsey's top officer who was working under Spruance, looked at the summaries and said, "The Japanese have handed us everything. We know where they'll be, when they'll arrive, and what they'll do. Now we just need to act." This incredible intelligence gave the smaller U.S. Pacific Fleet a rare advantage. By knowing Japan's moves ahead of time. The Americans would seem like they were reacting, but in truth, they were following a carefully planned strategy based on Japan's own messages. The Japanese fleet moved toward Midway with full belief in their plan, unaware that the Americans were quietly preparing to trap them. This mental edge gave the Americans an advantage as strong as their military one. At 2 a.m. on June 4th, Rochefort's team decoded one last Japanese message before the enemy went silent. It confirmed that Nagumo's carriers would launch their first attack at sunrise, just as American intelligence had predicted. The stage was set, and the Japanese fleet was heading straight into danger. As the sun started rising on June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo got ready to carry out what he thought would be another major win for Japan's navy. But he didn't realize that his scouting plans had major problems, which would stop him from spotting the approaching U.S. carriers. At 4:30 a.m., he sent out 7 scout planes from cruisers and battleships to scan the area ahead. For the Japanese, this seemed enough, but their search plan had serious gaps, something U.S. intelligence experts had already noticed from their code-breaking. 2 of the planned flights didn't happen due to equipment problems, and a third was delayed by 30 minutes. Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Watanabe, flying a seaplane from the cruiser Tone, was the only one who had a chance to spot the American fleet in time. He was assigned to look northeast of Midway, exactly where Admiral Fletcher's force was waiting. But due to a launch issue with his ship, he took off late, delaying this key sighting by over an hour. Meanwhile, on the USS Enterprise, American radar crews were tracking the incoming Japanese planes with great accuracy. Unlike the Japanese, who relied only on human eyes, the Americans had radar that could detect planes from over 100 miles away. This high-tech edge, added to their already strong intelligence, gave them multiple ways to stay ahead. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, in charge of Enterprise's air group, looked at the situation with growing confidence. The information he had from codebreakers gave him detailed knowledge about the Japanese carrier group, their timing, their routines, and their weakest moments when the decks would be filled with planes. His aircraft were ready and just waiting to be told where to go. The problems on the Japanese side went far beyond missed scouting flights. Days before the battle, their own submarines had picked up strange radio signals near Hawaii, and other sources reported more American aircraft movement near Pearl Harbor. Captain Kamio Kurushima, a senior planner under Admiral Yamamoto, had even warned during the planning stage that if the Americans had broken their codes, they might try to trap the Japanese fleet. But his concerns were pushed aside by officers who believed the codes were still safe. At 7:28 a.m., Watanabe finally sent a report that sent a shockwave through Nagumo's command. He spotted 10 ships, likely enemy, about 240 miles from Midway. But he didn't say what kinds of ships they were, or if they included carriers. This left Nagumo with a painful choice. His first attack group was already heading toward Midway, but the planes still on his carriers were equipped with bombs meant for land targets, not ships. To switch their weapons would take at least an hour, and during that time, the carriers would be exposed. To make matters worse, his officers disagreed. Some said the enemy ships were probably just smaller types, like cruisers. Others warned that this clearly meant the Americans had cracked their codes and were preparing a surprise attack. Commander Minoru Genda, though worried, advised caution. He told the admiral that if U.S. carriers were nearby, they already knew Japan's position and were likely coming to attack. But other officers, still riding high from past victories, argued they should keep going with the planned strike on Midway before worrying about other ships. At 9:18 a.m., Watanabe sent a second, even more serious report. He had spotted what looked like an American aircraft carrier. The American trap had already been set in motion. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen on the Akagi's bridge as he read the updated report. Now he faced the very situation Japanese intelligence had warned about. American carriers were in position and ready to strike. His planes attacking Midway were due back soon, and he'd need to clear the decks for their return. Meanwhile, the remaining aircraft still had the wrong weapons and were being rearmed to fight ships, a process that took more time. Even worse, American carrier planes were probably already in the air, coming for him. Commander Genda urged the admiral to act fast. He said they had to launch all available planes now, even if they weren't armed perfectly. They couldn't. Let the Americans attack while the decks were full of planes and fuel. Denda's years of experience told him this was their most dangerous moment. But Captain Okada, Nagumo's senior officer, said they should wait for the planes returning from Midway, get them safely back, and then strike with full strength. He warned that launching too soon would waste both planes and pilots. This back and forth cost them valuable time. Unknown to them, this exact delay had been predicted by American codebreakers. Rochefort's team had identified that this moment when the Japanese decks were busy with both outgoing and incoming planes was their most vulnerable. The Americans had timed everything to take advantage of it. At 9:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet in the first American attack. His squadron flew outdated torpedo planes, and while they didn't pose a major threat to the Japanese fleet, their attack forced Nagumo to change direction and delay his counterattack further. The Japanese fighter planes flew down low to stop the torpedo bombers, leaving the carriers open to the real threat American dive bombers coming in next. This chain of attacks was part of a carefully designed plan by the Americans who had studied Japanese air tactics closely. On the carrier Kaga, Lieutenant Commander Agusa watched the torpedo bombers approach. As one of Japan's top dive bomber pilots, he noticed how poorly his own fleet was responding. He told fellow pilots that it looked like the Americans knew what Japan had planned all along. Even in the middle of the fight, they were seeing evidence that the Americans had known their positions and defense setups in advance. U.S. planes were using radio calls and frequencies that showed they had a deep understanding of the Japanese fleet's layout. At 9:55 a.m., Nagumo finally made a decision. Despite all the difficulties, he ordered his planes to launch an attack on the American carriers. But it was already too late. As Japanese planes began moving into place, radar operators on Midway spotted more incoming American strike groups. Then came the main blow. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 dive bombers from the USS Enterprise straight toward the Japanese carriers. It was a perfect moment to strike. The Japanese carriers were wide open, their decks full of fueled and armed planes, defenses scattered after earlier attacks. At 10:26 a.m., McCluskey's dive bombers began their attack. Explosions tore through the Akagi's flight deck. Admiral Nagumo finally realized how badly they had been fooled. The Americans hadn't found his fleet by accident. They had known exactly where to look and when to attack. The surprise that Japan had counted on had completely backfired. The pause that cost Japan 4 of its top aircraft carriers and many of its most skilled pilots wasn't just a battlefield mistake. It was the result of ignored warnings, poor scouting, and secret plans that had been uncovered long before the first shot was fired. McCluskey's dive bombers from the USS Enterprise swooped down on the Japanese carriers like spirits of revenge. Their path was carefully chosen to cause the most damage. What happened next on the decks of Akagi Kaga and Soryu was something that would stay in the memories of Japanese naval forces for the rest of the war. Admiral Nagumo stood shocked as his own ship turned into a blazing fire. The first bomb that hit Akagi went through the deck near the center and exploded among planes being loaded with torpedoes and heavy bombs. This caused more blasts, setting off a chain of destruction that no crew could stop. Captain Yasaku Okatada, who had been giving calm advice just moments before, now stood in the ruins of his beliefs. "How did they find us so easily?" he asked Commander Ginda, his voice barely heard over the noise of the fires and explosions. It was a question that should have been asked weeks earlier, but now it was too late. The meaning of the American attack became clear to the Japanese officers, who survived. It wasn't random. The bombers didn't search aimlessly. They flew straight to their target and hit with shocking accuracy. This kind of accuracy wasn't possible without deep knowledge ahead of time. On the carrier Kaga, the crew tried with all their strength to fight the fires that were spreading through areas storing aircraft fuel. Captain Gyaku Okada's counterpart on Kaga realized that the American planes had hit the weakest points of the ship. They had focused on fuel lines, weapon storage, and maintenance zones as if they had full plans of how the ship was built. The pattern of the damage showed how deeply the Americans had understood Japanese carriers. Each hit was in a place that would cause even more explosions and make it nearly impossible to save the ship. It was clear the Americans had studied how Japanese carriers were built and used, and they found weaknesses that even some Japanese officers didn't fully know. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading a group of bombers from the Enterprise, showed how useful this information was. When he attacked Akagi, he didn't aim for the deck. He aimed where the planes returning from Midway would be refueled and armed. His bomb exploded among planes full of fuel and weapons, causing a massive fire that quickly destroyed the ship's ability to fight. As U.S. Navy reports later showed, early warnings from Catalina planes had helped Midway prepare its defenses and also told American leaders exactly where the Japanese carriers were. This turned intelligence knowledge into battlefield success. The last proof of Japan's failure in intelligence came from their only surviving carrier, the Hiryu Rear Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi, who was in charge of the second carrier group from. Hiryu had suspected for weeks that Japan's messages were no longer secret. As he saw the other carriers burning in the distance, he finally realized how serious the situation was. Poor message security had brought them disaster. "Get every available plane ready to launch," Yamaguchi ordered. "We must hit the American carriers before they attack again," but even this desperate attempt showed how much the Americans knew. The planes from Hiryu went up without knowing exactly where to go. They wasted fuel searching for the enemy, while the Americans already knew where Hiryu was. Japan's intelligence failure was now complete. Their pilots searched blindly over empty waters, while the Americans followed their movements using radios and radar. Though the Hiryu's planes did manage to hit the USS Yorktown, it was too late to change the result. American bombers, guided by exact knowledge of Hiryu's location, soon turned the last carrier into a burning wreck. By the evening of June 4th, Admiral Nagumo's powerful carrier group had been wiped out. For aircraft carriers, the heart of Japan's naval air power were either burning or had sunk. Even worse, hundreds of trained pilots and crew, who had taken years to prepare, were now gone. Japan had paid the full price for ignoring warnings. Their control over the Pacific, built through careful planning and brave action, disappeared in just one day. This happened because high-ranking officers didn't believe that their secret codes could be cracked or that their plans could be discovered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto got the terrible news about the loss of his carrier fleet. At 1 p.m. on June 4, 1942, he was still far from the battlefield. The man who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack and had placed all hopes on catching the Americans off guard at Midway was now faced with the truth. U.S. intelligence had completely outsmarted his plan. "Cancel the operation," Yamamoto said. Calmly, though inside he was heartbroken, "all units will pull back." He understood that without the support of aircraft carriers, his battleships and cruisers couldn't continue the attack. More importantly, he finally saw what had really happened. Japan had lost control of the war in the Pacific. Captain Kamito Kuroshima, Yamamoto's top advisor, who had earlier warned about weaknesses in code safety, approached his commander with a heavy heart. "Our radio intercepts suggest the Americans knew everything about our plan before it happened," he said quietly. This wasn't just a loss in battle, it was a disaster caused by intelligence failure. The proof was clear. American forces had been in exactly the right place, attacked at the best possible moment, and hit Japan's weak spots with amazing accuracy. No skill or luck could explain how well they did. The Americans had understood the Japanese side too well, and Yamamoto now believed that. In Tokyo, naval leaders struggled to understand how bad the situation really was. 4 of their most important carriers, which had taken years to build and staff, were lost in just one day. The loss of pilots was even worse. Japan's top group of naval flyers, those who had taken over much of the Pacific, was gone. Admiral Osami Nagano, head of the Navy's High Command, called an emergency meeting to think about what to do next. "We must consider that our secret codes may no longer be safe," he told the officers. "It's possible that the enemy has known about our plans for months." The review that followed showed that the problems went far beyond just the Midway battle. Japan's codes had likely been broken since early 1942. Giving the U.S. a clear picture of ship movements, battle plans, and timings. The success at Pearl Harbor had made Japan believe too much in their own system and caused them to ignore weaknesses in keeping messages secret. Lieutenant Commander Teishi Nakazawa, the intelligence officer whose earlier warnings had been ignored, was now called to explain what signs had been missed before the battle. "The facts were right in front of us," he told a group of top Officers, the Americans had clear radio information about our plans. Which ship was doing what, and exactly when we would attack. This was shared with the fleet leaders, but they refused to believe it. The investigation that followed uncovered problems in the way the Navy worked. Japanese military tradition expected officers to follow orders without question, which stopped important intelligence from getting to the people who needed it. The early victories made leaders too confident and unwilling to hear anything that went against their beliefs. More importantly, Midway marked the start of Japan's weakening position in the Pacific. Without control of the skies through their carriers, Japan's Navy could no longer fight across the wide waters of the Pacific. The combination of American factories producing war equipment and the advantage of better intelligence would slowly overpower Japanese forces in future battles. The loss of life from the intelligence failure was massive. Families across Japan lost sons and fathers because top commanders refused to believe that U.S. code experts could break their messages. The skilled pilots who died at Midway represented a level of experience that Japan could never rebuild. Admiral Yamamoto himself would eventually become a victim of this failure. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted information about his travel plans to visit bases in the Solomon Islands. U.S. intelligence, after decoding Japanese messages, launched a mission to kill him. Operation Vengeance. They shot down his plane, ending the life of the man behind the Pearl Harbor attack. Midway had become more than just a military defeat. It showed how the use of intelligence had changed warfare. The side that could understand the enemy's plans and movements had a huge advantage, no matter how skilled the other side was in battle. In the end, Japan's naval leaders ignored serious warnings, not because they didn't have the information, but because they couldn't accept the hard truth. Their pride and unwillingness to listen cost them greatly. The real cost of this failure was not only in ships and soldiers, but in the loss of the upper hand in the war. The outcome of the Pacific conflict had already been decided by those working quietly behind the scenes, solving codes long before any bomb had fallen on Midway.